I think if we're talking about what I think are probably the legitimate issues with a lot of people who go through the quote-unquote deconstruction, the point of deconstruction is reconstruction, because if you deconstruct something and you don't reconstruct it, it's just...
We believe that Adam and Eve were real. We believe that what is in the book of Genesis was like history. I would start asking these questions, and then I would like go to my pastor, go to these other people, I would ask them questions, and I didn't get satisfactory answers. When I told my wife that I thought evolution had happened, she burst into tears.
Yeah, I have a very close relationship with judgment.
Maybe there are actually answers that provide sufficient groundwork to actually reconstruct the deconstruction.
Wes Huff explains why so many people deconstruct and leave their faith, and it's absolutely wild. And that reminds me of when Rhett and Link deconstructed, and their reasonings were not very sound, and it seems like Wes Huff points everything out. So let's check out Rhett and Link's reasoning for deconstruction, and then we're gonna go to Wes Huff explain how you get past these problems. So here we go.
He kind of spearheaded this, the questions and the quest of, okay, I'm not satisfied with some answers I'm getting. I was his sounding board for his spiritual deconstruction. And so I think that I was, just kind of along for the ride, honestly, because my brain doesn't work in the same way. I was much more comfortable because I thought it was working for me. I thought that how I conducted my faith was more helpful than harmful. Actually, now I've started to realize over the past decade that there were a lot of things that were healthy for me to shed in terms of judgment and shame and how I processed that. But as a sounding board, I was pretty much just kind of like a step or two behind him in terms of my evolving beliefs.
Because as we said, you're the questioning personally, the decision to make a change in a direction of thought and how you operate your life is a real personal thing. That could have been a huge wedge and maybe the end of this partnership.
Well, and it started with the first person I kind of confided in was my wife, and I've seen this so many times. It's very unusual for a married couple that are both in a particular faith and one person says adios. Most of the time, those end in divorce.
Right.
The first time I told her, listen, we didn't believe that evolution happened. We believed that Adam and Eve were real. We believed that what is in the book of Genesis was like history. And so was
there a moment where this came, where you had a flash and you went, wait?
It was like I started reading about this in my early 20s, but mostly what I would do is I would go and I would be like, there's all these people saying that the Earth is, 10,000 years old, but like every time I go to a museum, they're like, this thing lived millions of years ago. I never looked into this, but I started reading about it. And actually I started reading from I would go to Christian sources, right? And there's a lot of Christians who don't.
Here's the thing though. You could believe that the Bible is historical and literal writings based off of history without having to do with anything to do with science. That's what is just so confusing. He put all of his faith off of being a creationist. Not what about Jesus and the historicity of Jesus?
Believe that there's a lot of Christians who believe in evolution, right? There's a lot of Christians who believe that the world is old or whatever and kind of accept the established science. And so I would slowly read these sources and kind of my view was changing. But then when it was like, I don't know how to reconcile this particular thing about, well, if we have this common ancestor with chimpanzees and apes and Adam and Eve, how do you explain that? I would start asking these questions, and then I would go to my pastor, go to these other people. I would ask them questions, and I didn't get satisfactory answers. And then it just was like a house of cards that was slowly falling until I remember writing in my journal. I was journaling at the time. I was like, I'm pretty sure I don't believe any of this stuff anymore, right? But all along the way, I would like when I told my wife that I thought evolution had happened, she burst into tears. I just want to give you an idea of where we come from and the worldview that we were all sort of held captive to. And so, but the funny thing is that
I never reacted that way.
No,
I'm
so
like,
I actually I would meter out the conversation with Jesse at the time, be like, she can only handle so much. But Link and I would hang out, and I would be like, bro, let me tell you the last thing that I read that really makes me think that none of this stuff is true. And you would listen. And again, you weren't the kind of guy that was going to go off and do the research on your own, but you were the kind of guy that was going to listen to someone who you trusted who had.
Yeah. I mean, I read a couple of books too, but like, it wasn't quite as...
You weren't searching. You weren't. He was seeking and sharing.
Yeah.
And you were listening and being much more passive.
Yeah.
So if he
and I value the security of what I had, and I just felt like there was a lot at stake in trying to. I was like, yeah, I'm gonna be here for you, and I'm gonna lovingly listen and respond and be a sounding board. But what I'm really gonna do is I'm gonna try to like say, yeah, but let's just kind of tamp all this down. Get it out of your system. I think is what I thought at first.
What he says here is absolutely just doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, why did you deconstruct your faith? It's fine to really look back and see, where does all of this come from? Why do you believe what you believe, not just based off of what your parents told you? I get that. But anytime you start just saying, well, someone else is making a different point, so I don't know if I can believe anymore. That's not the reality.
So what was the switch where you went, yeah?
I mean, it was just the preponderance of it. It just kept coming. I mean, anywhere you look, I mean, it's like it just kept coming. And I did start reading other people's accounts of deconstruction and their reasoning, and
was your wife also?
A lot of that resonated.
Did they have this? Did she have the same?
She was yes, because it was. We believed that it would split us up.
Yeah,
that like the biblical teaching that we adhered to was, okay, you're not going to stay together.
You can't do this without Jesus.
You're
basically,
not. Jesus is holding you together anyway. So
I mean, yeah, it's true, but it seems like such a terrible excuse. I know they've gone into this more of detail, but on the surface, it just seems so like they haven't thought much of it, and they just said, well, I don't need to be a Christian anymore. I don't want to live by these rules anymore. Who cares? It's not a big deal. So here's another video of them explaining why they deconstructed.
I think that there is this thing that sort of sits on both of our shoulders, which is coming from the background that we come from, where the old us would be judging the current us for our backsliding and debauchery of no longer being an evangelical Christian. And I've heard you talk about this maybe more than me, which is just like, you never let go of this thing that's like, am I going to be, even if you don't believe, am I going to be judged? Am I going to get cancer? Am I going to lose something?
Oh, like literally like smitten.
So I will be brought to my knees. Now, I actually think that I've heard you talk about that more than I've considered it. But
yeah, I have a very close relationship with judgment. Growing up in an environment of an all-seeing God who was frequently demanding, confession, and I grew very accustomed to that. And then I think over the past decade of moving out of some of those beliefs cognitively, it's still very it's all baked in here in terms of feeling almost like feeling more comfortable in an environment of judgment. So I'll assume judgment, like from my wife. I care very deeply about what she thinks of me, her opinion of me.
She loves you
She loves me.
so much. You have no idea.
I don't. Yeah, because I'll project this judgment on her.
She texts me all the time how bad she feels and how. Wait a second, this cut off.
Really?
But please go ahead.
No. I would welcome her talking to you more often. because let her judge you a little bit.
Yeah, really.
No, she doesn't. She's not actually judging me. I just think she is because I felt comfortable in that position. And that was that. I think that's the paradox you're talking about in a different way, I guess, is that I grew comfortable with a level of judgment that wasn't comfortable. It's just you get used to it. And then I'm in a space now where I think technically it's not there. I'm not actually experiencing nearly as much judgment as I did in my upbringing, but I'm having to learn how to exercise the freedom that I have in my worldview, if that makes sense.
It's weird because I'm a Christian and I don't feel like I'm being judged. And apparently maybe that was his relationship with God, is just a cop waiting for him to mess up so he could get beat up, like, or sent to hell or cast judgment on him, like this cosmic monster. I just don't ever see God like that. And that could be a problem. And now he thinks he has so much freedom, not living a life for something. It's weird. I never see that. So now I want to pull up Wes Huff here explaining why does someone deconstruct. And I think this will put everything into a lot of perspective.
I think if we're talking about what I think are probably the legitimate issues with a lot of people who go through the quote unquote deconstruction, I'm not sure that they were given the proper nutrients and foundation and soil quality to be able to grow roots that actually gave them subsistence, so that when those things did happen, it was somewhat too late already. And so I think, what I would want to encourage people is that the point of deconstruction is reconstruction. Because if you deconstruct something and you don't reconstruct it, it's just demolition, right? And so your worldview perspective shouldn't be a movement of demolition. Doubt is not a problem, but it's not the destination. So if we see doubt as the destination and we get fixated with that, we're not actually getting to the answers that we should be pursuing in a lot of those things. And unfortunately, I think that's what I see a lot, is that people are kind of taking doubt and they're putting it in the place of the final place where the answer should come from.
Wow.
And they're pushing into their questions, but without actually trying to seek answers. And in that sense, a lot of people become cynics rather than skeptics. Because I'm, to some degree, I'm a skeptic. I will reserve judgment on a particular topic until I feel like I have sufficient answers for any said topic. But a cynic, I think, is doing so because the questions are the endpoint for them. And I think that's where we should be honest and self-reflective and say, maybe there are actually answers that provide sufficient groundwork to actually reconstruct the deconstruction that we've been putting ourselves through. I think we're...
Yeah, I think instead of saying, oh, there's a problem here. Oh, I don't understand this. Oh, I don't know how to comprehend or explain something that's in the Bible. I guess we'll never find out, and I don't have to believe anymore.
We're in a unique point in time where people are open to certain things, and maybe they're in some regards disenfranchised with a superficial religiosity that they may have experienced. If they did grow up in the church, say, in my instance, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of just kind of superficiality, seeker sensitivity that I think had the right motivation, but the wrong method by which to go about that. In that they genuinely saw that they wanted to get people through the doors of the church, which is a good goal to have. But in doing so, what they were trying to win them with is what they won them to. And so because it was very superficial, it was very kind of on the surface, it didn't have any substantial depth. When the winds and the rains of trial and suffering, hurt, did eventually come, there was no root system to be able to ground them. You talked about, that having that foundation before. When my parents lived in Ontario, we moved our family across to British Columbia for a couple of years. And when we did move, my dad, my grandfather, and I drove our van and a U-Haul trailer across the country. And I remember very vividly in Saskatchewan driving across like the very flat fields, right? Watching a dog run away for a week. And seeing this giant tree in the middle of the field that just kind of stood out. And it was always this picture of, for me, you know, how did that tree survive? And the answer was, it had a root system that probably was both grounding it and pulling in the nutrients that were required for its particular growth in that point in time. But it's too late for the tree to try to grow the roots in the midst of the storm.
Is there one manuscript, ancient manuscript, that you've held that has completely impacted you, changed your heart, your faith?
Yeah, before he answers this, that's so good. We need to be honest with ourselves and see, what exactly are we putting our hope and trust in? Are we putting it in these third-degree problems? Are we putting it in the minor issues that we put so much weight and emphasis on? But really, those are just third-degree issues. You don't ever see someone being like, I just don't see there's enough evidence for there being a resurrection. It's rarely that. Like, I get it. You can't necessarily prove the resurrection, but there's amazing evidence.
Faith, and how old was it, and which one was it?
I don't think there's one that's necessarily kind of affected me strongly. Every time I get the opportunity to be able to hold in my hand or view something that goes, say, back to the 2nd or 3rd century, what it does for me is it encapsulates the fact that I can, to some degree, standing in front of, say, a 2nd century fragment of the Gospel of John, which I've done. What I feel in that moment is, you know, who was the person 2,000 years ago, almost 2,000 years, who was likewise standing in front of this piece of written material and putting the ink on the page. You know, it's this kind of looking down the timeline of history and including myself in it to some degree, within the family tree of, you know, there's no way to know whether the scribe was a Christian or not, but even hypothetically just kind of putting the idea in that maybe this was a late 2nd century Christian, and it would have been very costly for them to inscribe, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, onto a piece of material in a time frame when they could have been in a region that was illegal to do so. And so being in the family tree of historical Christianity and finding myself on a branch almost 2,000 years later, tying myself tangibly to that point in time, to that person, I think does something to the nature of the faith that I believe, in that I'm not an island. I'm part of a broader story that God has invited me into and invited so many other people, going back to, you know, calling the patriarchs, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God is a personal God and invites us all into that narrative and story. So it's this unique perspective of looking at an artifact and the artifact tying my own personal faith journey into.
Amen.
Have you held any manuscripts that are, whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, any pieces of those manuscripts written by somebody who directly witnessed the life of Christ, that you know, you're like, this is John. John wrote this. I'm holding it.
No. And the fact is we don't have any documents, written kind of artifacts, a papyrus or parchment, that would go back that early. The earliest documents that we have of the Bible go back to the 2nd century. But I think what we can say about that is that what we're dealing with, though it be a copy, is a copy that reflects what the original was written about. And this is also testified to by some of the early Christian writers who themselves were disciples of the disciples. Mm-hmm. So you have this category of people who we call the apostolic fathers, and they're called that particularly because they had a direct tie to Peter, to John, to Paul, and can comment on something like, We know who Mark is. He's the traveling companion of Peter. He wrote down that which Peter told him. We have these kind of testimonies. And so if we're going to call it like the dating of how we know that those documents are first century, coming in the eyewitness period, it's less to do with the tangible manuscript evidence that we have in saying, this was written by John, because I'm not even sure how you would identify that, even if we did find a first century manuscript.
I think it's my wishful thinking.
Yeah. And I think, in a modern sense, we have the capability to tie things back to, but that's true for everything from the ancient world. We have no document that we can call the original autograph of, whether that's Caesar or whether that's Marcus Aurelius, Plutarch, Xenophon, Tacitus, any of these ancient writers. We're all dealing with copies of copies of copies. And that doesn't dilute our ability to know that that is what the original authors wrote. But it's this fascinating network of the fact that the early Christians were very tenacious to get the gospel message out. And so the fact that we find copies in Egypt, but then also later on in places like Britain and across Asia and all over Europe and North Africa is a testament to the Christians were very eager to get the message of who Jesus was. And that meant that it was spread very far and very fast, very early on, which precluded any one person or group of people controlling the text at any one point in time. So though we don't have a copy that we can say, actually this is Matthew's copy and he wrote this with his own hand, the fact that we have copies of Matthew that are so widely spread throughout the ancient world, and we can compare them, and even if differences pop up in Asia, we know that those differences are geographically located because we don't find them in Europe or in North Africa. And so if someone wanted to, in a kind of Da Vinci Code-esque way, write in a particular doctrine to the Bible, they would have had to have the means of control to find all the copies in all the other places all across the ancient world and alter them. And that would have been just impossible because there are copies buried in the sands of Egypt. They would have had no idea.
And that's interesting because these stories line up amongst all these copies, these oral traditions that are passed on, then written down. The stories about Jesus line up. So you're right. In fact, the more copies there are, the more evidence there is that the stories about him are true and valid.
All right, y'all. 312,000 likes. Wow. Let's see.
I think if we're talking about Peter to John to Paul and can comment on.
That's so good. God, and we know from the late first century, we have writings of the church fathers quoting scripture. That's how we know that it was written within the first century, even though we don't have physical manuscripts from that time. There's pretty good hard evidence quoting this. And guys, we know that the Bible is not a translation of a translation of a translation. It is reliable. We can trust in it. We don't have to be worried or afraid that we could never know what the Bible actually says. Oh, that it's impossible. No, that's not the reality either. We can. And because people like Wes Huff, who does biblical manuscript writings and research, we can have faith without taking things just based off of what we've heard. And that's what's amazing, because Wes Huff is right. So many people in the 21st century, in the early 2000s, would just have surface level Christianity. No real reason for anything, no backing to historical context. It was just the Bible, barely the Bible, and that's it. And you got to take it for what it is without any research or any without any historical context either. And that could be a problem as well. Or realizing that there's other churches or denominations that believe different things than you, or there's other historical context that might be looked at a little bit different than you. And that's okay. That is okay. As long as Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior over your life. He died on the cross for your sins so that you could be saved. He is God's Son. He is part of the Trinity. He is God. So many things like that go hand in hand. Anyway, guys, shout out to Wes Huff. Very fascinating stuff. Make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I know we can do it with your help. So thank you so much for all the love and support. It means the world. Have an amazing day, and God bless.